Connecticut calls itself the Constitution state, but as our next guest will tell us, voter suppression is happening here.
Leah Wright Rigueur is an associate professor of American history at Brandeis University and joins us from her home here in Hartford. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning, Professor. 55
Good morning.
years after Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, why do these obstacles still persist?
So I think there are a couple of things to explore with regard to voting and democracy and voter suppression, voter depression. And the number one thing is that voter depression, voter suppression inhibits the actual practice of democracy. So it inhibits people from exercising their right to vote, exercising their political preference, and then ultimately having representation in office that represents the best interests of the individuals in question. So I think one of the things that we can point to in saying, why do these things continue to happen, is that it's about the exercise of power, that people in power, that people who are seeking power really try and push these various methods in order to establish some semblance and maintain some semblance of power.
Now, your expertise is national politics, but you do live here in Connecticut. Some barriers to voting that you see here in Connecticut, what are they?
So I think one of the biggest barriers to voting in Connecticut that we can talk about and that we can push to is, in fact, access to the polls. You know, one of the things that Connecticut doesn't do that sets us apart from many states, including states that pride themselves on really being good at voting, is having access to early voting. We don't do it. We haven't been able to do it. I know this has been a point of contention in the state for quite some time. But you know, this is what makes us different. This is what sets us apart. I think the other thing that we can talk about in terms of access to the polls is that in countries across the world, we see that where we see healthy democracies, right, high rates of voter turnout, we see things like there's a national voting holiday, right? So people have the day off from work. They don't have to compete with their work or with their jobs in order to show up to the polls. We see voting on things like Saturdays, right, in order to make it easier. We see childcare provided so that people can go to the polls. We also see things like transportation and access, right? The government will provide transportation to the polls to anybody who requests it or who needs it. So these are the kinds of barriers that we can talk about in terms of inhibiting access to voting.
Well, I think Connecticut's leaders could make public transportation free on Election Day. Are there states in the United States that do that?
Well, I know that there are a number of countries around the world that do that. There are also a number of states and areas and organizations that will provide transportation. But what we really might want to think about is, what can we do so that we don't have to put the responsibility or the onus on private institutions or things like churches, right? We've heard of souls to the polls, which is actually a really quite effective way of getting people to turn out. But what would it mean if the actual state or local governments provided access through various community means like buses or things like Uber or things, partnerships with Uber or something like that?
I wanted to ask you about an incident that took place in the state earlier this week, which I know you're aware of. Congresswoman Jahana Hayes was at a town hall, and it was a Zoom bomb situation, terrible racist slurs and insults. Would you characterize that as voter intimidation, voter suppression? Sure. Just talk about that if you would.
So I'd say, when we first started seeing these Zoom bombings, they really came out in the immediate, kind of immediate aftermath of the announcement of the pandemic, when everybody went into lockdown and quarantine. So we saw all these kind of, essentially trolling, especially political trolling, but by and large trolling where people were interrupting and saying racist, sexist, homophobic things, showing vulgar images and things like that. It largely died down, but it's experienced a resurgence, as we saw with Congresswoman Hayes recently, in part as an effort to silence people or intimidate people. So I think we can consider that a kind of voter suppression. But the interesting thing is that it may actually have the opposite effect. It may actually motivate people, particularly people who have been, either oblivious to what's going on, people who have been indifferent, to actually come out and vote against those kinds of repressive forces.
In Connecticut, hundreds of thousands of people have already cast absentee ballots under a new law. And we see around the country in states with early voting, voters lining up for hours. And what do you attribute this to? What's different this year, other than a global pandemic? But what's different this year in our politics? That is these extraordinary moments of democracy.
Sure. And I do want to highlight that, standing in line for 11, 12, 13 hours is not normal. That is not fundamentally democratic. And in fact, what we should be doing is trying to shorten the lines at the polls. Voting should be easy. It should be accessible. But I think one of the things that we're seeing, in these huge historic numbers is the number of people who are engaged in politics, but also the number of people who want to be invested in politics and want to be invested in the outcome. So not only are we seeing a huge turnout from a number of people in support of, say, Joe Biden, but we're also seeing larger turnouts amongst Trump voters. So there's this real interest, and I think the stakes for this election, regardless if you're Republican, Democratic, Independent, are really quite high in 2020. And that's what we're seeing with this mass turnout.
Professor Leah Wright Rigueur, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
She's been in Congress for 30 years, and as she runs for re-election, she's facing a well-financed opponent. We're talking about New Haven's Rosa DeLauro.
The next COVID relief package is not happening right now. Will there be a movement before the election to get one done? What residents, businesses, and state government have at stake?
Our Face the State Roundtable is next.